The earlier class, I spoke to you about basically what is called the Indian Renaissance. What is the Renaissance, by the way? I mean, do you understand the meaning of Renaissance?
It's a re-awakening.
Okay, a rebirth of learning, isn't it?
Yes.
And a scientific rebirth. It's not built on superstition and false knowledge.
Yes.
That is what the European Renaissance was all about. The Indian Renaissance also is like that, because the 19th century in India was an age also of a certain degree of empirical understanding of things, of a scientific understanding, rational understanding. And a lot of philosophy from England, which many of the Indian thinkers had also read, contributed to what we might call a kind of rational, unsentimental way of understanding knowledge. So the Bengal Renaissance, because that is where much of it happened, in a way, influenced developments in the west of India, in the south of India, elsewhere. For example, the Brahmo Samaj is very important. Brahmo Samaj is basically a Bengal-based movement. But Arya Samaj came up in the northwest of India. And then there was also, the Servants of India Society, which came up in Pune. So a number of little institutions like this over a period of time, which to a large extent imbibed the scientific, rational, modern attitudes of the Renaissance in Bengal, I think is responsible for an efflorescence of English prose in Indian writing. Okay? So it's just one of those coincidences in history that a number of people of great intellect should have been in the same place at the same time. For example, I am very interested in Carnatic music, South Indian classical music. And if you go to the middle of the 19th century, you will find that the three greatest composers of Carnatic music in the south, Tyagaraja, Dikshidhar and Shyama Shastri, all of them lived in the same place called Tiruvarur. Okay? So how do you account for that? How do you account for the fact that at the same time in England we had Wordsworth and Coleridge, Shelley and Keats and Byron, and all of them constitute a group of poets called the Romantic poets? How do you account for the fact that during the late 16th century and early 17th century, there were writers like Spencer, Marlowe, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Dekker, Beaumont and Fletcher, Donne, a whole range of writers, all of whom constitute what we might call the Elizabethan and then the Jacobean tradition in English fiction. So these are not matters which we can explain. But one good explanation which I can give is that Calcutta was then the metropolis, while Madras was not given the same importance. In fact, it was called a benighted city, a benighted town. And it's only in the last 50-60 years that South Indian history of the Raj is being written. There's a lot of work being done now, very interesting in its own right. But I'm deviating from our main concern. Let me talk about Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo briefly, because Bankim and Ram Mohan Roy have already been touched upon in an earlier class. Now, Swami Vivekananda, like Bankim, had a Brahmo upbringing. He knew the Brahmo Samaj. He was even a member of the Brahmo Samaj for a while. And he was also an early graduate from the Calcutta University like Bankim Chandra. So the trajectory, the intellectual trajectory of some of these intellectuals seems to be more or less similar. But Swami Vivekananda was a man of tremendous energy, inquisitiveness, curiosity, and he was not prepared to accept any of the values of his tradition simply like that. He would question it. And as I told you, he was a student of Hasty. And Hasty told him, if you want to know God, go to Dakshineshwar and you meet Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And accordingly, Swami Vivekananda went to Dakshineshwar, which is in the outskirts of Calcutta. And there is a book in English which is called The Gospel of Ramakrishna. In Bengali, I think it's called Ramakrishna Charitamrita. which is written by M. M is Mahendranath Gupta. And it is a very detailed account of the last 10 years of Ramakrishna's life. And you get a wonderful intimate picture of how Swami Vivekananda actually had arguments with Ramakrishna on several occasions. And Ramakrishna would say, "Why have you not come all these days? I've been waiting for you. You've come so late. You've been teasing me." Like that. Because here was a guru who knew that his disciple has come. It's not always the disciple who's in search of a guru. The guru also is waiting for the right disciple to come to him. And both together create a wonderful world of wisdom and knowledge. So when Vivekananda went to Ramakrishna, he, I think, understood the meaning of the spiritual life. And there are many instances which I will not go into, but suffice it to say that because of his deep reverence for Ramakrishna and his encounter with him and his association with him, Swami Vivekananda rose from an ordinary state to a kind of a superhuman consciousness. And it is this energy which allowed him to travel the length and breadth of the country like the great saints of the ancient past. Shankaracharya is supposed to have gone around the country 3 times on foot. And Swami Vivekananda, of course, was a modern sannyasi. But one of the things which he did was to respond to missionary criticism. Remember, I talked about missionaries and their activities and how it created problems in Hindu society. And the missionaries were constantly attacking Hindu customs, usages, calling it superstitious and lacking in any kind of scientific basis. And they were trying to create the impression that Christianity was the only religion worth following. That is their belief, but it is not a correct belief. I think from a point of view of modern thought, I think all religions have their own truth value, and it's not necessary for you to say this is better than that or this is more important than the other. And I think Vivekananda understood this. He also realized that much of this talk was possible only because India was in such poverty that it was under British rule. So he was also responding to colonial rule. So this mix of spiritual brilliance and resentment at the humiliation which his society was facing under this kind of a modern British rule, I think was a combination which was very, very potent. So when he went across in 1893 with the help of the Maharaja of Khetri and the Maharaja of Ramanad, they were the ones who funded him for his travels to America. He landed in Chicago in 1893, and there he made one of the great speeches, the very first speech he made at the World Parliament of Religions. I want to read out that speech for you because I think it is a good example of not just spiritual wisdom but also great English prose, because Vivekananda is a master of English eloquence. In fact, one of the phrases I have used for this book of mine, for the collection of book, is the literature of eloquence. And here is Vivekananda making this wonderful speech in response to the welcome which America gave all the delegates of the World Parliament of Religions. He made 5 speeches there, and there are wonderful discussions of what Hinduism is all about, the connection between Buddhism and Hinduism. For Vivekananda, Buddhism is not an antithesis of Hinduism, it is a completion of Hinduism. Just as Hinduism is a completion of Buddhism, one without the other is actually an orphan, according to him. And he talks about the fact that all these delegates who were in the World Parliament of Religions have enjoyed so much warmth and hospitality, and he thanks America. He calls her Columbia because Columbus discovered America, and he writes about, "Hail Columbia, the land where freedom is all the time visible. Thank you for giving us such an opportunity. Thank you for welcoming us," and so on. But all those speeches pale into insignificance before this first speech. And he took his time. He was one of the speakers who was given a chance only later in the day. And when he made his speech, this is what he said: "Sisters and brothers of America." And I'm told, according to newspaper reports, that there was sustained applause for 5 long minutes when he said this. No preacher who had come there could say, "Sisters and brothers of America." It could come only from a man who understood not this religion or that religion, but the basis of all religion. And that is what he's saying here. It fills my heart with joy unspeakable to rise in response to the warm and cordial welcome which you have given us. I thank you in the name of the most ancient order of monks in the world. I thank you in the name of the mother of religions, and I thank you in the name of millions and millions of Hindu people of all classes and sects. My thanks also to some of the speakers on this platform who, referring to the delegates from the Orient, have told you that these men from far-off nations may well claim the honor of bearing to different lands the idea of toleration. I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. I am proud to belong to a nation which has sheltered the persecuted and the refugees of all religions and all nations in the earth. I am proud to tell you that we have gathered in our bosom the purest remnant of the Israelites, who came to southern India and took refuge with us in the very year in which their holy temple was shattered to pieces by Roman tyranny. I am proud to belong to the religion which has sheltered and is still fostering the remnant of the grand Zoroastrian nation, the Parsis. I will quote to you, brethren, a few lines from a hymn which I remember to have repeated from my earliest boyhood, which is every day repeated by millions of human beings. And this is the prayer: as the different streams having their sources in different paths, which men take through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee. The present convention, which is one of the most august assemblies ever held, is in itself a vindication, a declaration to the world of the wonderful doctrine preached in the Gita. Whosoever comes to me, through whatsoever form I reach him, all men are struggling through paths which in the end lead to me. Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism have long possessed this beautiful earth. They have filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with blood, with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now. But their time is come, and I fervently hope that the bell that tolled this morning in honor of this convention may be the death knell of this fanaticism, of all the persecutions with the sword or with the pen, and of all uncharitable feelings between persons wending their way to the same goal. I think this is a matter for pride, that a person could speak like this in 1893, and the English language has been enriched by that kind of a speech. And of course, since most speeches are also written up before you make the speech, it's also part of our great tradition of Indian English prose. Aurobindo was brought up in a completely westernized family. He had no whiff of Bengali or Sanskrit or even Hindu culture, because his father didn't want him to be infected, let me put it, by anything Indian or anything Hindu. That was the kind of upbringing he had, and his siblings also went through the same kind of training. In fact, when Sri Aurobindo was sent to England for studies, he was called Aurobindo Ackroyd Ghosh. Ackroyd being an English name. He was given an English name, he was given an anglicized character. And this same Aurobindo, who spent many years in the West, imbibing the best of classical traditions, Latin, Greek, English literature, he had read all this. He had no idea whatsoever of the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, or the Puranas, or the Upanishads, or the great literary texts of India. And in the turn of the century, he was supposed to sit for the civil service exam. And he sat for it. And he passed it brilliantly. But then something happened to him. In order to become an ICS officer, Indian Civil Services officer, today we call them the IAS. In those days, ICS was a steel frame of bureaucracy. You had to pass a riding test. You had to be on a horse and show that you can ride a horse. Because many of these ICS officers were posted as district collectors and so on, and they had to tour the districts on a horse, all right, riding, because they didn't necessarily have trains and cars and so on. Now, Aurobindo did not go for the test. And he was invited a second time to do this because they gave him a grace period. He wouldn't go for the riding test, and he failed the ICS exam as a result. So he never became an ICS officer. I think that was a providential moment in Indian history, because this same Aurobindo, Ackroyd Ghosh, who did not become an ICS officer, came back to India and in 1909 entered the service of the Maharaja of Baroda, became a professor of English and philosophy, and taught in Baroda for a while, and did a great deal for education in Baroda. But those years were also years of great training. He, for example, learnt yoga, he began reading Sanskrit, he began understanding the intricacies of the Indian philosophical system, and he began to meditate. And I think a point came when he plunged into nationalist politics. As you know, he was even jailed in the Alipur Central Jail for his role in what is called the Chittagong Armory case. That is, in today's language, he would have been a terrorist. And I think there was some proof that he was actually part of a gang which was trying to overthrow the British through violent means. But when he was in jail, they were not able to find enough evidence, so they had to release him. And in jail, Aurobindo pointed out, he went through a tremendous transformation, and one day he had a great vision of Lord Krishna. That was a decisive moment in his career. When he came out of jail in 1909 or thereabouts, he suddenly disappeared from the public sphere. And everybody thought that he was escaping from British persecution and so on. And then one day he emerged in Pondicherry, and there in Pondicherry, he was no longer Aurobindo Ackroyd Ghosh, he was Shri Aurobindo.
So he had also Atimanasa Sakti.
Atimanasa Shakti. That was a kind of superhuman consciousness or strength, isn't it?
Yes.
Atimanasa means that which is superhuman.
Yes, sir.
Shakti is strength, consciousness. And he did believe in what is called the supramental, right? The higher levels of consciousness. And I think in Sri Aurobindo's scheme of things, which I don't know too well in terms of the philosophy, I am told that divinity sort of descends on the individual when the individual is ready for it. Very clearly, Sri Aurobindo was a chosen one of this providence.
So
Okay?
I think that is Atimanasa Shakti.
Atimanasa
Yes.
Shakti. Okay. So there you are. But the point which is of importance for us is, I mean, it's all right to say that he was in politics, that he went to jail and then he went to Pondicherry. But what happened? He began writing. And some of his greatest writings are in great, beautiful prose. One of the books which he wrote, which I think any Indian student should read if you want to be really a student of India, is Foundations of Indian Culture. In that book, he very clearly shows, and he takes issue with William Archer, the English dramatist, who has condemned India's civilization and called it barbaric and lacking in any kind of value. He condemns it without knowledge, without proper understanding. And Sri Aurobindo, through a whole series of chapters, shows how Archer's views are all completely lopsided and completely distorted. Aurobindo talks about medieval Europe. in that in one part of that essay. And he says that medieval Europe was a spiritual Europe. Remember that medieval Europe was Catholic, and the Catholic Church was the center of existence for everybody there. Catholic Christendom was responsible for creating a certain kind of deep spiritual energy amongst Europeans. You can call it the Dark Ages, you can call it the Middle Ages, but the fact still remains spiritually very, very evolved. Some of the greatest saints of Europe also come from the Middle Ages. And Sri Aurobindo's theory is that Europe is no longer the Europe which we now have. Modern British rule is the result of a new kind of European attitude of colonialism, exploitation, capitalist greed, materialism, and so on. They have lost their connection with the spirituality of an earlier day. India has not lost that spirituality, and therefore, if Europeans can recover their spirituality, they can do business with India, and India can do business with them. That is why people like William Archer don't understand India, because they have not remembered, or they have become amnesic, they have been struck by amnesia of their own cultural heritage that they need to recover. Since they are not likely to recover it in a long time, India has something to offer the world in terms of spirituality. So one of those great arguments. And then he says how this spirituality also created a particular kind of society organized around castes. Of course, Sri Aurobindo is a little ambivalent about caste here. He's talking about caste as a positive thing which organizes society in terms of people's mental attitudes, temperament, and the need for a division of labor. I'm sure he doesn't accept the stratification of caste which has prevented people from becoming close to one another. It has separated people rather than brought people together over a period of time. But that was not the meaning of caste, or that was not the purpose of caste when it first came into prominence or into vogue. It was a division of labor. It was an organic society where everybody was interdependent. And then he goes on to talk about the spiritual values which have created the great epics of India and the great scriptures of India. And he gives you a wonderful description of how India has evolved over a period of time. It's one of those books which everyone should read because it's a matter of national pride. And these are essays written in the early 10, 15, 20 years of the 20th century, when India was still under British rule and laboring under the colonial yoke. So you have this book which is a kind of a response to British colonial tyranny. Gandhi and Nehru, two people who are deeply bonded, because Gandhi always thought of Nehru as his spiritual heir. In fact, he declared him my successor, and that is why Nehru became the chief leader of the Indian national movement of the Indian nation after Gandhi was assassinated. But two people more different in temperament you can't think of. Gandhi deeply spiritual, deeply inward, deeply austere. Nehru outgoing, ebullient, exuberant, modern, socialist, almost atheistical. Okay? Two people who do not necessarily have much in common, and yet they seem to have attracted each other so much. And I think between them, they created modern India. I think the contribution of these two people and their writings in English, because Gandhi also wrote a lot in English, in transparent, plain, simple English, because he believed that language is there only to communicate. You should not use language to obfuscate. You should not become obscure. What you have to say it in clear terms. And when you read his English, you really have an object lesson in how you should be writing in your own term papers and your essays and so on. It's a very clear, straightforward, direct style. And it's very appealing. It looks simple, but actually to write like that is very difficult. And I'm not talking about the autobiography, the story of my experiments with truth, but I'm certainly talking about Hind Swaraj. Both the autobiography and Hind Swaraj are translated into English. So you have to understand that the original writing was in Gujarati and then came into English. But Gandhi also wrote a lot in English, particularly in his journals and in his communication with people in different parts of the country. And his style is a style which is calculated to persuade people into accepting an important issue or a particular argument. It's a very persuasive, discursive style of writing. If you look at Nehru, whole attitude is different. He's exuberant. He's a student of Cambridge University. He's a Fabian socialist, and he has ideas of transforming India from its old feudal setup into a modern nation state. And that is why when he became Prime Minister, he was constantly looking towards the Soviet Union for help, because he felt that the socialist pattern of society was best suited for a wonderful land like this, which was in the grip of old feudal elements and so on. So he didn't have much use for traditional values of the kind which Gandhi, for example, believed in. In The Discovery of India, which all of you should read, it's a very long book, about 700 pages I think, but extraordinarily wonderful reading. He talks about, and it's a remembered India, you see, because he's in prison. And in prison, he doesn't have notes, he doesn't have books, and he doesn't have anything to consult, no internet in those days. He just remembers what he has read and what he has absorbed through his long years of study. And he goes back to the great past of India and then tries to show you how India has developed over a period of time and why we are where we are today. And he tries to show you that we have to select from tradition those usable parts of it, so that that past can be used for the present moment. Not everything in the past needs to be accepted. But he has a wonderful appreciation of things which one would never imagine Nehru would be interested in. For example, some of the most eloquent pages in The Discovery of India are about Adi Shankara. Adi Shankara was a Vedantin, a philosopher, a deeply Hindu thinker, with whom Nehru couldn't possibly be in great sympathy, and yet he is able to go beyond himself and read a text which is not his own, which is different from his, which is other than him, and give it the best possible treatment which anybody can hope for. That was one of the great things which Nehru was capable of, able to see the other point of view. Similarly, when he speaks of Buddha, he is more sympathetic with Buddha, because Buddha is a reformer within Hinduism, and he is trying to reform Hindu society of some of those bad practices. And he created a more socialistic environment in the form of the Sangha and all that. You see, but Nehru is able to see Buddha in perspective and to talk about him with great eloquence. Similarly, when he talks of Ashoka the Great, Nehru is really eloquent, and it goes on like that. There are many passages in the Discovery of India which in my opinion are the finest prose written by anybody in India. Finest. And if Nehru had not drifted into politics, well, he didn't drift, he was in politics all the time. If he had drifted into literature, let us say, I am pretty sure that he would have been a very strong candidate for the Nobel Prize in Literature. That he didn't win it is partly because he didn't devote more time to writing. He wrote a great autobiography, he wrote The Great Discovery of India, and he wrote Glimpses of World History, letters to his daughter Indira Gandhi, and giving you an overview of the historical process. But these are written with such eloquence, such passion, such sincerity, that you will find that here is a man who is an object lesson for style. You want to understand how to use the English language elegantly? Go to Nehru. And don't you remember that wonderful Tryst with Destiny speech of his? And do you remember that wonderful passage where he talks about dying and about how he would like his ashes to be spread all over India, in the mountains and in the rivers and the sea? Because he's not religious, he says. He's not wanting to be cremated in the usual Hindu fashion. Of course, cremation is what happened to him, but he would like those ashes to be distributed through the atmosphere of India, because he is India and India is him. That kind of a great eloquence, that great passion for the country is what you get in that prose. So I have now tried to speak to you in 2 modules about the development of Indian English prose. I began by asking questions about whether prose is great literature or not, and I have also tried to show you that prose can be great literature. And clearly, when you read Ram Mohan Roy, or when you read Swami Vivekananda, when you read Sri Aurobindo, when you read Nehru, and when you read Gandhi, you see that Indian English prose is obviously something to be reckoned with, something which we must concentrate on, and something we should be very proud about. Thank you very much.